August 25th, 1947. The afternoon sun slants through the windows of Rosecliff Mansion, catching dust motes that drift through rooms once filled with the glittering laughter of America's most powerful families. A solitary figure walks through the ballroom, not a guest in silk and diamonds, but a potential buyer, calculating renovation costs with a furrowed brow. The parquet floors, which once reflected the jewels of Vanderbilts and Astors, now show signs of water damage. The gilt is tarnishing. The crystal chandeliers hang like forgotten promises. This is Rosecliff, a palace built to rival Versailles, a monument to the most extravagant era in American history, a summer cottage that cost more than most Americans would earn in 1,000 lifetimes. Beautiful, yes. A masterpiece of Beaux-Arts architecture, absolutely. But beneath the romance of its white terracotta facade lies a darker story, one of compulsive ambition, tragic loss, crushing debt, and the slow, inevitable collapse that awaits all empires built on sand. Because here is the question that haunts these halls. Can beauty built on borrowed glory survive when the party finally ends? And what happens to a dream when the dreamer is gone? Let's go back to the beginning. To understand Rosecliff's fall, we must first understand its glory. Picture it. The summer of 1902. Newport, Rhode Island, America's undisputed capital of conspicuous consumption. Here, along a stretch of coastline that would become known as Millionaire's Row, the industrial titans of America built their summer cottages, a laughably modest term for palaces that put European royalty to shame. And among these monuments to excess, Rosecliff stood out. Designed by the celebrated architect Stanford White and completed in 1902, Rosecliff was modeled directly after the Grand Trianon at Versailles, Marie Antoinette's personal pleasure palace. But this was no mere copy. This was America's answer to European aristocracy, a declaration that new money could build just as beautifully as old blood. The approach was deliberately orchestrated for maximum impact. Guests would arrive through wrought iron gates, their carriages, and later their motor cars, crunching along a curved gravel drive. Then, suddenly, the mansion would reveal itself, a H-shaped palace of white glazed terracotta, luminous in the summer sun, its symmetrical wings embracing a formal garden that seemed to flow endlessly toward the sea. The scale was breathtaking. 40 rooms spread across approximately 80,000 square feet. But numbers alone cannot capture the sensory experience of Rosecliff. Step inside. The entrance hall greets you with soaring ceilings and walls adorned with delicate plasterwork. Every surface seems touched by an artist's hand, but it is the ballroom that takes your breath away, the largest ballroom in Newport, measuring 40 by 80 feet, with a ceiling that rises 30 feet high. French doors on 3 sides open to terraces, blurring the line between interior and exterior, creating the illusion that the party might spill out endlessly across the lawn and into the ocean beyond. Here, beneath chandeliers dripping with crystal, America's elite would waltz until dawn. The room could accommodate 300 guests, and often did the parties thrown by Rosecliff's original mistress, Theresa Fair Oelrichs, became legendary. The White Ball, the Fairy Ball, elaborate theatrical productions performed on the terraces. At one event, she famously had a ship constructed in the ballroom, transforming the space into a maritime fantasy. The effect was one of effortless elegance. Guests saw only beauty, only perfection, only the seamless execution of refined taste. They heard chamber orchestras and smelled French roses. They tasted champagne that cost more per bottle than a working man's monthly wage. They danced on floors polished to a mirror finish. But what they didn't see was the machine, because behind every moment of Gilded Age splendor was an army of invisible hands. Rosecliff required a permanent staff of approximately 28 people just to maintain basic operations. During the social season, roughly 12 weeks each summer, that number could swell to over 40. Let's break down this hidden workforce. Inside the mansion, a hierarchy as rigid as any feudal system governed the servants' world. At the top stood the butler, who managed the male staff and oversaw formal service. He commanded a small army, footmen, a wine steward, valets for the gentlemen guests. Below stairs worked the kitchen brigade, a chef, sous chefs, kitchen maids, scullery maids. The head housekeeper ruled over the female servants, ladies' maids, housemaids, laundry maids, seamstresses. These people lived in the mansion's hidden spaces, cramped servants' quarters on the third floor, accessible only by narrow back staircases designed to keep them invisible. While the family and guests slept in rooms with ocean views and elaborate moldings, the staff occupied small, sparse chambers that often lacked even basic ventilation in the summer heat. Their days began before dawn. By the time Mrs. Oelrichs woke, usually around 10 in the morning, the house had already been transformed. Fireplaces cleaned, floors swept and polished, flowers arranged, breakfast prepared. The work was constant, exhausting, and utterly invisible when done correctly. Outside, the gardens required their own dedicated team head, gardeners, undergardeners, groundskeepers, perhaps a dozen men working year-round to maintain the formal plantings, the sweeping lawns, the hidden vegetable gardens that supplied the kitchen. The estate encompassed approximately 11 acres, every inch of which needed constant attention. Then there were the tradesmen, plumbers, electricians, painters, carpenters, masons. A house of this size was always in need of repair. The salt air from the ocean corroded metal, weathered wood, degraded masonry. Maintaining that pristine white terracotta facade required constant cleaning and periodic replacement of damaged sections. But the most shocking cost wasn't labor. It was simply keeping the lights on. Rosecliff was one of the first mansions in Newport to be fully electrified, a technological marvel that required its own power plant in the basement. The coal-fired generators that provided electricity also heated water for the elaborate plumbing system, modern conveniences that marked the Oelrichs as progressive among their peers. The coal consumption was staggering. Even during the summer months, maintaining hot water, generating electricity, and running the kitchen ranges required tons of coal each week. During parties, when every chandelier blazed and the ballroom stayed lit until dawn, consumption could quadruple. The annual operating cost of Rosecliff during its golden years has been estimated at approximately $250,000, equivalent to roughly $7 million today. And that was just maintenance. That didn't include the elaborate parties, the custom gowns from Paris, the fresh flowers shipped in daily, the champagne, the caviar, the orchestras hired for a single evening's entertainment. To put that in perspective, in 1902, the average American worker earned about $400 per year. The cost to run Rosecliff for a single summer season exceeded the lifetime earnings of multiple working-class families. This was the hidden engine behind the beautiful facade. This was the price of perfection. And it all depended on one thing: continuous, enormous wealth. The question that no one asked in those golden summers of the early 1900s was simple but terrible. What happens when the money runs out? To understand why Rosecliff fell so hard, we need to understand the woman who built it, because Theresa Fair Oelrichs was not simply a rich woman playing at aristocracy. She was a woman trying to prove something, to escape something, to transform herself from rough Western money into Eastern elegance. Theresa Alice Fair was born in 1871 into sudden, spectacular wealth. Her father, James Graham Fair, had struck it rich in Nevada's Comstock Lode, one of the richest silver deposits in American history. But mining wealth carried a stigma in the eyes of Eastern establishment families. It was new money, Western money, dirty money earned from the ground, rather than inherited through generations of respectable enterprise. James Fair was a difficult man, ruthless in business, cruel to his family, prone to drinking and scandal. When Theresa was just 14, her parents' marriage collapsed in a divorce so bitter and public that it scandalized San Francisco society. The proceedings revealed James Fair's numerous affairs and violent temper. Theresa and her siblings were caught in the crossfire, forced to testify, exposed to newspaper headlines that dissected their family's private misery. For Theresa, this public humiliation became a defining trauma. She grew up determined to distance herself from her father's coarseness, to prove that fair money could buy not just luxury, but refinement. She would become more than a mining heiress. She would become a queen of society. In 1890, at age 19, she married Hermann Oelrichs, a charming German-American whose family had made their fortune in shipping. Hermann was handsome, educated, and most importantly, accepted by New York's old money families. The marriage gave Theresa social legitimacy, and her vast inheritance, estimated at $12 million, roughly $350 million today, gave the couple the resources to establish themselves at the very pinnacle of Gilded Age society. They had everything a couple could want: wealth, youth, beauty, social position. And yet, beneath the glittering surface, cracks were already forming. Hermann Oelrichs was a chronic gambler, a weakness that would eventually contribute to the family's financial problems. But in the early years of their marriage, such concerns seemed distant. The money flowed endlessly from the Nevada silver mines. The future seemed secure. And Theresa had a vision. In 1899, Theresa commissioned Stanford White, at the height of his fame as America's most celebrated architect, to design her ultimate statement: a summer residence that would silence any whispers about Western money and rough origins. She wanted a palace that would make the Vanderbilts jealous, the Astors impressed. She wanted perfection. Stanford White understood the assignment. The Grand Trianon at Versailles provided the template, but this would be an American interpretation, adapted for seaside entertaining on a scale that even the Sun King might have envied. The construction took 3 years and cost approximately $2.5 million, equivalent to roughly $80 million today. Every detail received obsessive attention. The terracotta facade was specially glazed to create that luminous white finish. The ballroom's heart-shaped staircase became an instant icon. The gardens were designed to showcase different varieties of roses, giving the mansion its name. But Rosecliff wasn't just about display. Theresa had genuine artistic sensibilities. She was an accomplished amateur actress and playwright, often writing and producing elaborate theatrical presentations for her guests. The mansion's generous terraces and that enormous ballroom were designed as performance spaces, where the line between life and art, between reality and theatrical spectacle, could blur beautifully. This was her dream, a place where she could create moments of transcendent beauty, where the trauma of her childhood could be forgotten, where she could be remembered not as the daughter of rough James Fair, but as a patroness of arts and beauty, a woman of impeccable taste who had created something lasting and fine. For nearly 2 decades, the dream worked. The parties at Rosecliff became legendary throughout Newport and beyond. Her white ball in 1904 remained a topic of conversation for years. Guests dressed entirely in white, the ballroom decorated with white roses, creating an ethereal effect that seemed to lift attendees out of ordinary life. Her fairy ball featured guests in elaborate costumes with butterfly wings, the gardens illuminated with thousands of hidden electric lights, magic made real through money and imagination. Theresa reigned as one of Newport's undisputed queens. She had achieved her transformation. The mining Harris had become an arbiter of taste. But empires built on silver are more fragile than they appear. Hermann Oelrichs died suddenly in 1906, collapsing during a business trip to Europe. He was only 48 years old. For Theresa, the loss was devastating, but financially, it was manageable. Her own inheritance remained intact, and Hermann's shipping interests provided additional income. What she didn't fully realize was that maintaining Rosecliff as she envisioned required not just wealth, but specific types of wealth: stable, growing, diversified wealth. Her fortune remained largely tied to mining stocks, subject to the vagaries of commodity prices and mine production. And the Comstock lode, which had made her father rich, was beginning to play out still. Through the 1910s and early 1920s, Theresa maintained her position. The parties continued. The mansion remained pristine. On the surface, nothing had changed, but beneath the facade, the machine was becoming harder to sustain. Operating costs continued to rise. Labor became more expensive as servants gained more options and fewer young people wanted to accept the rigid hierarchies of domestic service. The cost of coal, of food, of maintaining aging systems, everything trended upward while the income from her investments grew more volatile. Theresa began making small compromises. Fewer parties each season, smaller staff during the off-season, delayed maintenance on less visible parts of the estate. Nothing dramatic, nothing that guests would notice, but the trajectory was clear to anyone paying attention. The machine was slowly grinding down. Then came 1926, and Theresa Fair Oelrichs, the woman who had built a palace to prove her worth, died of a heart attack at age 55. Her death marked the end of Rosecliff's golden age, but it would take another 2 decades for the dream to fully collapse, because here's the cruel truth about grand visions: they rarely survive their visionaries, the heir who didn't want the crown. When Theresa died, Rosecliff passed to her only child, Herman Oelrichs Jr., a man whose life had been shaped by the enormous shadow of his mother's ambitions. Herman Jr. was 40 years old in 1926, married to a woman from a respectable but not wealthy New York family, father to 2 children. Unlike his mother, he had no particular passion for society, for entertaining, for maintaining the elaborate performance that Rosecliff demanded. He also inherited a problem that his mother had carefully hidden from the world. The Oelrichs' fortune was not as secure as it appeared. Let's examine the numbers. When Theresa died, her estate was valued at approximately $3 million, substantial, but not the inexhaustible wealth everyone assumed. More troubling, much of that wealth remained tied up in mining stocks and other investments that provided inconsistent returns. The annual income from these investments varied wildly, from as high as $150,000 in good years to barely $30,000 in bad years. And remember, Rosecliff cost approximately $250,000 per year to operate at full capacity. Do the math. Even in good years, maintaining the mansion at his mother's standard would consume more than the estate's entire annual income. In bad years, it would require liquidating principal assets just to keep the lights on. Herman Jr. found himself in an impossible position. He could either dedicate his entire inheritance to maintaining his mother's dream, essentially becoming a servant to a house, or he could make the hard choice to let it go. For 2 years, he tried to maintain appearances. He kept a skeleton staff year-round. He opened the mansion for abbreviated social seasons, hosting smaller, more modest entertainments. He told friends and fellow society members that he was simply modernizing the approach to Newport living. But privately, he was taking meetings with real estate agents, preservation societies, and potential buyers. He was looking for an escape. The crisis deepens. Then came 1929, and the choice was made for him. The stock market crash in October devastated the Oelrichs' portfolio. Mining stocks, always volatile, plummeted. Conservative investments that had provided stable income suddenly became worthless. Overnight, what had been a manageable financial challenge became an existential crisis. By 1930, Herman Jr. could no longer afford even basic maintenance on Rosecliff. He made the painful decision to close the mansion entirely and dismiss all but a single caretaker. The doors were locked, the furniture covered with sheets, the gardens left to grow wild. For 11 years, from 1930 to 1941, Rosecliff sat empty, a ghost palace on Millionaire's Row, slowly deteriorating while Herman Jr. tried desperately to find a buyer. But who could afford such a place in the Great Depression? The annual operating costs alone exceeded what most wealthy families wanted to commit. The property taxes were crushing. The deferred maintenance was mounting by the month, leaking roofs, failing plumbing, weather damage to the terracotta facade. The interested parties were all wrong. Developers who wanted to demolish the mansion and subdivide the land, speculators hoping for a bargain they could flip, occasionally a wealthy individual who would tour the property, calculate the restoration costs, and politely decline. Herman Jr. lowered the asking price again and again, from $1.5 million to $1 million, to $750,000 to $500,000. Each reduction was a knife in the heart, an admission that his mother's great achievement, the palace that was supposed to last forever, was essentially worthless. This is the dark reality of grand architectural visions. They become financial prisons for the next generation. In 1941, a buyer finally emerged, but not the buyer anyone expected. Gertrude Vanderbilt Neeson was a Broadway and Hollywood actress who had married a wealthy industrialist. She was drawn to Rosecliff not as a symbol of old society, she had no particular interest in that world, but as a spectacular setting for entertaining Hollywood friends and East Coast theater people. She saw a possibility where others saw a burden. The sale price? $350,000, less than 1/4 of the original asking price, and barely more than it had cost to build the mansion 40 years earlier. For Herman Jr., it was both a relief and a humiliation. He had preserved his mother's palace from demolition, but only by surrendering it for a fraction of its supposed value to a woman who represented everything the old Newport establishment looked down upon: new money, entertainment industry money, money without pedigree or social standing. The irony was almost too perfect. Theresa Fair Oelrichs had built Rosecliff to escape her own origins in rough Western mining money and to prove herself worthy of Eastern society's respect. Now her palace was sold to Hollywood money, the new generation's equivalent of rough Western cash. But there's something beautiful in this irony, too, because Neeson, unencumbered by the weight of Newport social expectations, was willing to make the pragmatic adaptations that would allow Rosecliff to survive. The new Rosecliff? Gertrude Neeson didn't try to recreate Theresa's vision. She recognized that the Gilded Age was over, that the model of vast summer cottages maintained for 12 weeks of parties no longer made economic or social sense. Instead, she simplified. She reduced the permanent staff to fewer than a dozen people. She closed off entire wings of the mansion during the off-season. She replaced expensive fresh flowers with simpler arrangements. She stopped trying to maintain the perfect manicured gardens and instead let them naturalize in places, reducing the groundskeeping staff. Most importantly, she opened Rosecliff for a new kind of entertainment, less formal, more eclectic, mixing theater people with society people, Hollywood stars with Newport dowagers. The rigid social hierarchies that Theresa had both craved and enforced began to blur. Neeson owned Rosecliff for 6 years, and while she never made the mansion profitable, she stopped its decline. She proved that the palace could exist in a modified form, adapted to a changing America where grand formal entertaining was increasingly seen as anachronistic, but even her modified approach had limits. By 1947, facing her own financial pressures and perhaps exhausted by the constant demands of the estate, Neeson decided to sell. This time, the buyer was J. Edgar Monroe, a wealthy New Orleans oil heir who purchased the property for approximately $150,000, less than half what Neeson had paid just 6 years earlier. The downward spiral continued. The long decline. Monroe's ownership represents Rosecliff's darkest period. He rarely visited the mansion, using it primarily as an investment property and occasionally renting it out for private events. Without an owner who cared about preservation, deferred maintenance accelerated. The terracotta facade began to show serious deterioration, interior plasterwork cracked and fell. The once immaculate ballroom developed water stains from roof leaks. By the 1960s, Rosecliff had become a cautionary tale in preservation circles, a magnificent building sliding toward ruin not from malice, but from simple economics. No one wanted to invest in maintaining it properly. No one could figure out a sustainable use that justified the cost. The question everyone was asking: can a building designed for a vanished way of life survive in a world that no longer values what it represents? The answer came in 1971, when the Preservation Society of Newport County, which had already saved several other Gilded Age mansions, acquired Rosecliff from Monroe's estate. But this wasn't salvation through preservation of the original vision. This was salvation through complete transformation of purpose. The Preservation Society's model was radical for its time. They would open these palaces to the public as museums, allowing ordinary Americans to pay a small fee to tour the very rooms where they could never have been invited as guests. The servants would be replaced by docents. The private entertainments would become public spectacles. The exclusive would become inclusive. Rosecliff underwent extensive restoration in the early 1970s, funded by admission fees, donations, and grants. The terracotta facade was cleaned and repaired. The ballroom was returned to something approaching its original glory. The gardens were reconstructed based on historical photographs, but make no mistake, this was not the Rosecliff that Theresa Fair Oelrichs had envisioned. This was its ghost, preserved in amber, transformed into an educational attraction. Today, approximately 40,000 people visit Rosecliff each year. They pay roughly $25 per person to walk through rooms where guests once stayed for weeks at a time. They take selfies in the ballroom, where Theresa once hosted elaborate theatrical productions. They browse the gift shop in what was once the servants' wing. The mansion survives. But does the dream? I visited Rosecliff on a gray November afternoon, well after the tourist season had ended. The mansion was open, but nearly empty. Just a few scattered visitors moving quietly through rooms designed for noise and laughter. Standing in the ballroom, I tried to imagine it as Theresa saw it, ablaze with light, filled with hundreds of guests, an orchestra playing waltzes, champagne flowing, the ocean breeze carrying the scent of roses through the open doors. I tried to hear the rustle of silk gowns and the murmur of conversation. But what I actually heard was silence, broken only by the clicking of a docent's heels in the next room and the distant sound of waves. This is the strange melancholy of preserved mansions. They survive, yes, but they survive as something other than what they were meant to be. They become stages for a performance that ended long ago, museums dedicated to a way of life that exists now only in photographs and careful restoration. The docent, a retired teacher who volunteers at Rosecliff, told me something interesting. She said that visitors often have two distinct reactions to the mansion. Some are enchanted by the romance of it all. They see the beauty, they imagine the parties, they dream of what it would have been like to attend a ball in this magnificent space. For these visitors, Rosecliff is a fairy tale made real. But others, she said, feel something darker. They calculate the cost, not just in dollars, but in human terms. They think about the servants who made this beauty possible, living in cramped quarters and working 18-hour days. They think about the broader social inequality of the Gilded Age, where a tiny elite commanded resources that could have transformed countless lives. They think about the environmental cost, the coal burned, the resources consumed, all for the pleasure of a few summer weeks. For these visitors, Rosecliff is a monument to excess, a cautionary tale about the price of unchecked ambition and inequality. Both reactions are valid. Both are true. Because Rosecliff's story is not unique. It's part of a larger pattern that played out across Newport and other Gilded Age enclaves. Consider the numbers. At the height of the Gilded Age, Newport boasted approximately 40 grand cottage estates along and near Bellevue Avenue. These palaces represented billions in today's dollars, employed thousands of servants, and consumed enormous resources. Today, about 15 of these mansions survive as museums or are preserved by their original families. The rest, demolished, subdivided, converted to schools or condominiums, or left to decay until they became dangerous and had to be torn down. The pattern is always the same. A wealthy family builds a dream palace. The founder dies. The heirs struggle with maintenance costs. The fortune proves less durable than the building. Eventually, the property must be sold, repurposed, or demolished. Even the Vanderbilts, America's wealthiest dynasty, couldn't maintain their Newport estates indefinitely. The Breakers, Marble House, and other Vanderbilt mansions all eventually passed to the Preservation Society. The money that seemed inexhaustible in the 1890s was, in fact, exhausted by the 1960s. This raises a philosophical question that goes beyond mere architecture. What is the relationship between beauty and sustainability? Can we create things of lasting magnificence without creating unsustainable burdens for future generations? It's worth noting that European aristocratic estates often survived where American Gilded Age mansions failed. Why? The answer reveals something about the different nature of wealth and legacy in these two societies. European estates were typically built over generations, with inheritance laws that kept properties intact and passed them from heir to heir as complete entities. The families who owned them had centuries of experience managing large estates and built diverse revenue streams, tenant farms, timber rights, mineral rights, that could sustain the property even when the family fortune declined. American Gilded Age fortunes, by contrast, were usually made in a single generation through a single industry: railroads, mining, steel, oil. These fortunes were spectacular but volatile, and American inheritance law encouraged the division of estates among multiple heirs, fragmenting both the fortune and the sense of obligation to maintain ancestral properties. Moreover, European aristocrats had social and cultural roles that extended beyond mere wealth. They were expected to maintain their estates as part of their duty to the broader community. American industrialists had no such obligation. Their mansions were purely personal statements, monuments to individual achievement rather than family legacy. So when the fortune faltered, there was no broader social structure to catch these falling palaces. They were private projects that lived and died with the wealth that created them. This brings us back to Theresa Fair Oelrichs and the question she never had to answer. What kind of legacy did she actually create? In her lifetime, she achieved her goal. She transformed herself from the daughter of a rough mining magnate into a queen of refined society. She created moments of transcendent beauty. She proved that new money could build as magnificently as old blood. But what survives of that achievement? The building survives, yes, but as a museum, not a home. The ballroom survives, but silent, not filled with music. The gardens survive, but maintained by a preservation society, not by a family that loves them. None of her theatrical productions survive. They existed only in the moment, in memory. The social triumph she worked so hard to achieve meant nothing to later generations. Within 50 years of her death, no one except historians remembered the elaborate parties that had once seemed so important. What Theresa couldn't understand was that she was building her legacy on sand. Not because she lacked taste or vision or resources, but because she was trying to create permanence in an era of profound social transformation. The Gilded Age was not a stable aristocratic society like those of Europe. It was a brief flowering of industrial wealth concentrated in the hands of a tiny elite during a period when there were few taxes, no labor laws, and vast income inequality. This concentration of wealth was never going to last. Progressive reforms, income taxes, labor regulations, and eventually the Great Depression would shatter the economic conditions that made estates like Rosecliff possible. Theresa built her palace at the high water mark of an era that was already beginning to recede. She just couldn't see it. You might wonder why any of this matters. Why should we care about the decline of a mansion built by wealthy people over a century ago? Because the fundamental question Rosecliff raises is timeless. How do we build things that last? How do we create beauty and meaning in a changing world? And what obligations do we have to maintain the creations of previous generations? These questions are intensely relevant today. We live in another Gilded Age. Wealth inequality rivals that of the early 1900s. Billionaires build vanity projects, mega yachts, private islands, space programs that dwarf even the extravagance of Rosecliff tech fortunes are made and sometimes lost with spectacular speed. And we face the same question: what will survive? Which of today's grand projects will still exist in 100 years? Which are built on solid foundations and which are built on sand? The lesson of Rosecliff is not that we shouldn't build beautiful things. Beauty matters. Art matters. Architecture matters. Theresa Fair Oelrichs was right to want to create something magnificent. The lesson is about sustainability, about building things whose beauty doesn't require impossible financial burdens to maintain, about creating in ways that acknowledge the work of human hands rather than hiding it, about understanding that true legacy isn't just what you build, but whether what you build can adapt and survive in a changing world. The Preservation Society's solution, transforming Rosecliff into a museum, represents a kind of redemption. The mansion now serves far more people than it ever did as a private palace. Its beauty is accessible rather than exclusive. Its lessons about history and society are available to anyone willing to pay a modest admission fee. In a strange way, Rosecliff has achieved a more democratic and potentially more lasting legacy as a museum than it ever could have as a private palace. But something was still lost in that transformation. Something about the original vision, about the possibility of creating private beauty on a grand scale, about the dream that individual excellence could create lasting monuments. In the end, Rosecliff's story is about the price of dreams, both the cost of achieving them and the cost of maintaining them. Theresa Fair Oelrichs paid a high price to realize her vision. The constant social performance, the need to always be elegant and gracious and perfect, the weight of proving herself worthy again and again to a society that would never fully forget her origins, the sacrifice of a more spontaneous, less orchestrated life. Her son paid a different price. The burden of inheriting a dream he never asked for, a palace he didn't want, a social position that felt more like a prison than a privilege. The servants paid in physical labor and subjugation to a rigid hierarchy that denied their humanity in service of maintaining the illusion of effortless elegance. Society paid in the resources diverted from productive uses to support extravagance that benefited only a tiny elite. And yet, walking through Rosecliff today, it's hard not to feel some gratitude that it exists, that someone cared enough about beauty to create this. That somehow, despite all the obstacles, this magnificent building survived to be enjoyed by new generations. The question isn't whether the price was too high. Different observers will answer that differently based on their values. The question is, knowing the full price, understanding all the hidden costs and the ultimate trajectory of decline, would you still build it? And if so, how would you build it differently? At the beginning of this investigation, I asked, can beauty built on borrowed glory survive when the party finally ends? And what happens to a dream when the dreamer is gone? Rosecliff gives us an answer, though perhaps not the one Theresa Fair Oelrichs would have wanted to hear. The beauty survives, but transformed. The dream survives, but adapted beyond recognition. The palace endures, but only by becoming something its creator never intended. This is both tragedy and triumph. It's tragic that Theresa's specific vision, the private paradise, the stage for her creative and social ambitions, the symbol of her transformation from Western mining heiress to Eastern sophisticate, could not survive even a single generation beyond her death. But it's triumphant that the beauty she created, the magnificent building she commissioned, the artistry she demanded, now serves thousands rather than dozens, that children from modest backgrounds walk through rooms designed for aristocrats, that the mansion she built to exclude now welcomes. Perhaps that's the real lesson. Our creations will outlive us, but they will be reshaped by the needs and values of future generations. We can build for the ages, but we cannot control the ages. We can create beauty, but we cannot dictate the terms of its survival. The only buildings that last are those that can adapt. The only dreams that survive are those flexible enough to accommodate the dreams of others. And the only legacies that endure are those that offer something of value beyond the ego of their creators. Rosecliff endures not because it successfully maintained Theresa's original vision, but because it was beautiful enough to be worth saving for reasons she never anticipated. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's the most any of us can hope for. To create something good enough, beautiful enough, meaningful enough that others will find reasons to preserve it, even if those reasons differ from our own. The story of Rosecliff mirrors the broader arc of the Gilded Age itself. An era of spectacular wealth and artistic achievement built on profound inequality and unsustainable extraction of resources. An era that produced magnificent art and architecture even as it exploited workers and concentrated power in fewer and fewer hands. An era whose excesses ultimately provoked reform movements that fundamentally reshaped American society. We're still living with the consequences of that transformation. The progressive income tax, labor regulations, antitrust laws, Social Security, all emerged in reaction to Gilded Age excess. The very reforms that made estates like Rosecliff economically unsustainable also created a more equitable society. Was the trade worth it? Should we mourn the loss of these private palaces or celebrate their transformation into public institutions? The answer, I think, is both. We can mourn the loss of a certain kind of beauty and ambition while celebrating the more democratic society that emerged. We can appreciate Theresa Fair Oelrichs' vision while recognizing its limitations and unsustainability. History isn't simple. Legacy isn't simple. And the buildings that survive to tell these stories carry all that complexity in their walls. What Rosecliff teaches us about today. Standing in Rosecliff's ballroom, looking up at the restored ceiling and the gleaming chandeliers, I found myself thinking about the mega mansions being built today. The 50,000 square foot houses going up in Greenwich and the Hamptons and Silicon Valley, the vanity skyscrapers purchased by billionaires as private residences. The private islands and compounds that make Rosecliff look modest by comparison, will any of them last? Will they adapt and survive as Rosecliff has, transformed but preserved? Or will they suffer the same fate as most of Newport's Gilded Age cottages, demolished, forgotten, remembered only in photographs? The answer depends on whether today's builders learn the lessons that Rosecliff teaches. First, beauty that depends on vast hidden infrastructure and armies of invisible workers is inherently fragile. The more complex the machine required to maintain the facade, the more vulnerable the creation becomes to economic or social disruption. Second, private monuments to personal achievement rarely survive their creators unless they offer something of public value. Buildings that serve only ego don't generate the goodwill or support necessary for preservation. Third, sustainability matters more than initial splendor. Fourth, the values that justify extravagance change over time. What seems obviously worth the cost in one era can seem obscene in the next. Build for your own time, and you may find your creation has no place in the future. These lessons apply beyond architecture. They apply to businesses, to institutions, to any grand vision that requires sustained resources over time. The companies that last aren't usually the flashiest or most extravagant. They're the ones that build sustainable models, serve genuine needs, and adapt as circumstances change. The institutions that endure aren't those most devoted to preserving the founder's exact vision, but those willing to evolve while maintaining core values Theresa Fair Oelrichs built for glory. She succeeded, but the glory proved temporary. Had she built for sustainability, for adaptability, for public benefit, the outcome might have been different, or maybe not. Maybe the economic and social forces that doomed private palaces were simply too powerful to resist. But let's not lose sight of the human story at the center of all this analysis. Theresa Fair Oelrichs was a real person, with real pain and real dreams. She grew up watching her family torn apart by scandal. She spent her life trying to prove she was more than her father's money, more than Western roughness, more than the newspapers said about her family. She succeeded by the standards of her time. She was admired, respected, welcomed into the highest circles. She created beauty that people remembered for decades. And yet, one wonders, was she happy? Did the palace she built provide the validation she sought, or did the need to constantly perform, to always maintain the illusion of effortless perfection, become its own kind of prison? We don't have many personal letters or diaries from Theresa. The public record shows a successful society matron, but the private person remains largely hidden, like the servants' quarters tucked away on the third floor. Present but invisible, essential but unacknowledged. Maybe that's fitting. Maybe Theresa's whole life was about creating a public facade while hiding the complicated, wounded human reality beneath. If so, Rosecliff was the perfect expression of her life's work. A beautiful surface sustained by hidden machinery, elegant rooms built over servants' cramped quarters, a palace that looked permanent but rested on unstable foundations. I began this investigation asking whether beauty built on borrowed glory could survive when the party ends. But perhaps that's the wrong question. Perhaps the right question is, what kind of beauty deserves to survive? Not all grand projects merit preservation. Not every ambitious vision should be sustained beyond its natural lifespan. Sometimes buildings should be allowed to fall, their materials recycled, their space reclaimed for purposes better suited to new times. Rosecliff survived because enough people believed it was worth saving, not for its original purpose, but because it could teach something valuable about history, about architecture, about society. It survived because it was beautiful enough and significant enough to justify the ongoing cost of maintenance. That seems like a reasonable standard. Preserve what teaches, preserve what offers beauty or knowledge or inspiration to future generations. But be willing to let go of the rest, no matter how grand it once seemed. This is perhaps a more modest approach to legacy than Theresa Fair Oelrichs would have liked. She wanted her creation to endure on her terms, serving her vision. Instead, it endures on terms she never imagined, serving purposes she never intended. But it endures, and in a world where so much vanishes, where most Gilded Age palaces are gone, where fortunes evaporate, where even the names of once powerful families fade from memory, mere endurance is itself a kind of victory. Rosecliff stands. 40,000 people a year walk through its doors. They marvel at the ballroom, photograph the staircase, imagine the parties. Some learn about history, some learn about inequality, some simply appreciate beauty. Theresa's specific dream may have died with her, but the beauty she created lives on, adapted and transformed, serving the democracy she could never have imagined. Perhaps that's the best any of us can hope for, that what we create will be good enough to justify its continued existence, even in forms we wouldn't recognize. Perhaps that's enough. If you've made it this far in this investigation, thank you. These deep dives into the hidden stories behind grand historical subjects take considerable time and research to produce, and your attention means everything. The story of Rosecliff is one of dozens of similar tales from America's Gilded Age. Palaces built with spectacular ambition, sustained through immense hidden labor, and eventually transformed or destroyed by changing economic and social conditions. Each has its own particular drama, its own human story of ambition and loss. I want to hear from you. Which Gilded Age mansion should I investigate next? Should I explore the breakers, the largest and most opulent of Newport's cottages, and the Vanderbilt dynasty that built it? Should I venture to North Carolina to investigate Biltmore, America's largest private residence, and whether it succeeded where other estates failed? Or perhaps we should examine the darker side of these fortunes, the labor strikes, the poverty, the social movements that eventually challenged Gilded Age excess? Leave your suggestions in the comments below. Your input genuinely shapes the direction of this channel. If you found this investigation valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It's a simple action that makes an enormous difference in helping these detailed, research-intensive videos reach a wider audience. This kind of deep, narrative-driven historical documentary isn't what algorithms typically reward, but it's what I'm passionate about creating. Every like, every subscription, every comment helps prove that there's an audience for this approach to history. You can also support this channel directly through the membership program or Patreon, linked in the description below. Channel members get early access to videos, behind-the-scenes research notes, and the opportunity to vote on upcoming topics. Your financial support makes it possible for me to dedicate the time these investigations require. More than anything, though, I appreciate you watching. I appreciate your intellectual curiosity. I appreciate your willingness to spend 15 minutes exploring a question that most people never think about. What happens to grand dreams when the dreamers are gone? The answer, as we've seen, is complex. Sometimes dreams adapt and survive in unexpected forms. Sometimes they collapse under their own weight. Sometimes they become cautionary tales. And sometimes, just sometimes, they become public treasures that serve purposes their creators never imagined. Rosecliff endures, transformed but still magnificent, still teaching, still offering beauty to anyone willing to look closely at what it represents, both the glory and the cost, both the achievement and the price. That seems like a fitting legacy for a palace built by a woman trying to prove her worth to a world that would eventually forget why proof was ever necessary. Thank you for watching this investigation. I'll see you in the next one.